One of the things that fascinates me about Rorty's contingency, irony, and solidarity are the tensions within the text itself. Rorty tries to set out this vision of a particular kind of culture, a particular kind of doing philosophy, or maybe not doing philosophy, a particular form of life. And it seems to me that as he tries to set out that vision, he continually ends up saying things that don't fit what he said elsewhere. He ends up telling narratives that undercut the very ideas that he started those narratives with. I think we will see a very clear example of that in chapter 3 when we think about some of the things that Rorty says about language. But I also think that here in chapter 2, Rorty ends up telling a story about the strong poet that actually undermines the very distinction between the private and the public that is so important for the entire story of the book. Is that a problem? Does it make it a bad book? No, I think it's in many ways a great book, and one of the ways it is great is that we can learn so much from Rorty's struggle to give words to the kind of vision that he has. And we can learn from where he succeeds, but we can also learn from where he fails, or where he might seem to fail. So let's delve into the second half of this second chapter, the contingency of selfhood. And we left off at around page 30, where Sigmund Freud, the Austrian psychiatrist and one of the great theorizers about the human psyche of the 20th century, bursts onto the stage. So what is the importance of Freud to Rorty? Well, there is a sense in which Rorty takes Freud's importance as a cultural figure as given. And I believe that if we read books written in, let's say, the 1980s, one of the most, sort of sensible differences between us readers now and those writers back then is the stature of Freud. Right, back in the 80s, Freud was still, this towering cultural figure, this almost inescapable voice in lots of debates. Not so many people are talking about Freud nowadays. I'm not saying that to diss Freud. I actually kind of like Freud. But, when Rorty quotes, say, Bloom as saying that Freud is inescapable, well, that's I think, in a sense, hard to feel for us now in the 21st century. Anyway, that's maybe not so important. What's important is what Rorty thinks Freud does for us. And Freud's central, discovery or the central feature of Freudian thought that Rorty is interested in is that Freud, on Freud's way of thinking about the human psyche, all the important things about the human psyche are the result of these very local, very contingent histories. Right, so of course we know that, let's say, when Freud analyzes a psychosis or a hysteria or some other psychological problem, what he tends to do is not apply some, off-the-shelf theory to this person, or, look for a specific physiological cause, let's say in the person's brain or diet or something like that. What Freud does is he starts talking. Or rather, he lets the patient talk, and he lets the patient talk about things that happen to them, and especially about things that happen to them in their early life. And Freud's framework suggests that what happens in early life, and maybe later on, but especially in early life, has all these almost unimaginable, almost unrecognizable consequences later in life, so that our entire view of ourselves, our entire way of conducting ourselves, our morality, our sexual feelings and perversions, our psychological problems, our relationship problems, and so on and so forth, are the result of this very detailed, very personal, and of course very contingent history. Like what happened to us at these various stages in our lives. And so what Freud does is he eschews any sort of big theory about humanity that would be applicable to everyone. Well, he has some theories, but I guess the best way to say this and certainly the way that Rorty would want to say is that whatever theories Freud has, they are supposed to be tools for telling these very private, very local, very contingent tales about ourselves. And those tales would explain not just, our psychological problems, but even things like why one person is very religious, why one person is given over to certain types of crime, and so on and so forth. So like the lowest elements of like the supposedly lowest elements of human behavior, like these psychoses or something like that, and the highest elements of human behavior, things like moral behavior or religious faith or a I don't know, a wish to spend a lot of time doing philosophy. That surely is the highest element of human life. They're sort of all handled in the same way. And so Freud turns the self from something that we might have a very universal and neatly hierarchical theory about, right? The kind of theory that we might find in somebody like Plato, who says, well, first of all, there's reason, and then there's something like courage, and then there are the bodily appetites. That's the hierarchy of the soul, and it's all about making sure that reason predominates and not the other ones. That kind of story doesn't fit into the way that Freud tells his stories at all. A Freudian story would always be a personal story, something that applies to one man once. Only to one man once, and that one, well, maybe dying, certainly at some point dying. So Freud is a teller of contingent tales, and somebody who in telling those tales breaks down all those traditional distinctions between, the moral and the non-moral, the rational and the non-rational, the high and the low in general. So this also means, says Rorty, that Freud gives us a sort of framework for rethinking morality. Right, moral growth for somebody who has been impressed by these kinds of Freudian tales. The image of that is not so much somebody who finally climbs towards the light, who finally sees the true structure of their selves, or who finally manages to align their self with some pre-existing, moral law out there. Moral progress is more something like breaking out of the limitations of your past. Right? It's getting to understand your past, seeing how your past made you who you are, and then, changing it, right? Allowing yourself to be free and maybe to be good or to be kind in ways that were impossible for you before because you didn't realize how you became the person you are. Again, very local, very contingent. So Rorty makes a contrast, I would say almost a humorous contrast, on page 34 and 35 between Kant and Nietzsche. And so here Nietzsche is seen as the person who is there for the genius, the strong poet, the person who wants to innovate, who wants to become someone unique. And Kant is presented, maybe a bit unfairly, as somebody who sees that the unselfish, unself-conscious, unimaginative, decent, honest, dutiful person is paradigmatic. So Kant, is seen here as somebody who sets up a moral theory, which is very sort of unassuming. All you have to do is sort of realize that you are under these obligations to do your duty, and it's in a sense not that hard to understand what is your duty. Not that Kant claims that we're all infallible, but he definitely thinks that, the common man and woman in the street has a pretty good grasp of what it would be to be moral, right? It's to not lie and not murder and, not do, for your own, maybe like for your own wealth or whatever, something that hurts other people, right? Those are the kinds of things that we all know perfectly well that we oughtn't be doing. And so there is a sense in which you can think of Kantian morality as something that ought to make the world safe for these honest, kind of dull people who do the right thing. I don't think it's a completely fair portrayal of Kant, and there are some wild sides to Kant too. But okay, this is the way that Rorty sets it up: Kant versus Nietzsche. And so he says, well, it has often seemed, this is the the top of page 35, it has often seemed necessary to choose between Kant and Nietzsche, to make up one's mind, at least to that extent, about the point of being human. But Freud gives us a way of looking at human beings which helps us evade the choice. After reading Freud, we shall see neither Bloom's strong poet nor Kant's dutiful fulfiller of universal obligations as paradigmatic, for Freud himself eschewed the very idea of a paradigm human being. Right? So what Freud does for us is by suggesting that we're all these kind of unique beings with these contingent histories, none of which, fits some pre-existing ideal, some ideal that exists somewhere outside of society, outside of history. That sort of takes away the temptation to ask, well, who is the paradigmatic human being? And it generates the temptation to say instead that, some people are just very innovative and some people are kind of dull. And, that's the way things are. And of course, a good society is a society that gives each of them as much room as possible, as much possibility to be happy or to pursue their goals, maybe. I think Nietzsche would prefer the latter formulation, to pursue their goals. Because Nietzsche tells us that clearly the pursuit of happiness is not his goal, because he is not Englishman. I think that's he is thinking of Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the utilitarians, the English utilitarians there, who would say that happiness is precisely the goal of every human being. Okay, so that is what Freud does for us. But Freud does something else too. Freud helps us alleviate the elitism of Nietzsche's philosophy. Right, and there is something very, very elitist about Nietzsche's philosophy, and in a sense that is, to a certain extent, it's the glory of Nietzsche's philosophy, that he sort of asks us to try this almost impossible thing, which almost nobody, or maybe nobody, can actually achieve. But of course, that means that most human beings aren't even, half a step towards this ideal of recreating themselves and becoming gods and so on and so forth. And so most human beings are, just these kind of dull, okay, they're there. And I think in Nietzsche's, what I would think of as Nietzsche's best passages, he's not quite dismissive of those people. Like he would say that it's the duty of the stronger spirits to sort of care and make the world safe for the weaker spirits. I believe he says something like that at the end of the Antichrist. I'd have to look it up. Okay, that I guess is a sort of left-wing reading of Nietzsche, which, I don't know, might be not necessarily, I don't know whether it's accurate. It might be more my own personal preference. Maybe one day we will come to Nietzsche on this channel and read some of his stuff. So here is what Freud does. Freud basically tells us that nobody is dull. Here's the bottom of page 35. For Freud, nobody is dull through and through, for there is no such thing as a dull unconscious. What makes Freud more useful and more plausible than Nietzsche is that he does not relegate the vast majority of humanity to the status of dying animals. For Freud's account of unconscious fantasy shows us how to see every human life as a poem, or more exactly, every human life not so racked by pain as to be unable to learn a language, nor so immersed in toil as to have no leisure in which to generate a self-description. That's Rorty's own. Like those last phrases are Rorty's own, what he would call liberal addition to Nietzsche. In most of his moods, Nietzsche probably wouldn't be adding that. So what Freud does is basically, like, through things like the analysis of dreams, he shows us that everyone, like even these seemingly most dull people, have this incredibly creative unconscious, which generates these incredibly creative dreams, and which, tends to influence our conscious behavior or our waking behavior in all kinds of ways that are really hard for us to trace, unless we have studied Freud to a very large extent. So what Rorty is kind of suggesting here is that the strong poet doesn't have to be a poet, right? It could be somebody whose creativity doesn't show itself in these generation of works of art or like really new vocabularies, but pops up in their life in different ways. He goes on to say, and this is at the top of page 37, he goes on to say that the intellectual, the person who uses words or visual or musical forms for this purpose, is just a special case. Just somebody who does with marks and noises what other people do with their spouses and children, their fellow workers, the tools of their trade, the cash accounts of their businesses, the possessions they accumulate in their homes, the music they listen to, the sports they play or watch, or the trees they pass on their way to work. Anything, from the sound of a word through the color of a leaf to the feel of a piece of skin, can, as Freud showed us, serve to dramatize and crystallize a human being's sense of self-identity. And a little later on, Rorty says, any such constellation can set up an unconditional commandment to whose service a life may be devoted. What Rorty seems to be saying here, what he seems to be pointing out is that, a lot of us have very unique stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what the purpose of our life is. And that story can be a story of, being this enormously creative poet who generates totally new stories, but it could also be, the story about how you are the person who really knows everything about butterflies in the place where you live and who has worked very hard with the local council to make sure that the right flowers and bushes are planted and so on and so forth. That's also a way, a totally different way, but that's also a way to generate a sense of self-identity, to tell a story about what you ought to do, who you are, and therefore what you ought to do. I'm not totally certain why Rorty thinks that all of this falls under the heading of redescribing life and saying of everything that happened, thus I willed it, which is, the Nietzschean phrase and the way that the strong poet might be describing themselves. Because the individuality and contingency of all these forms of giving meaning to one's life by themselves do not necessarily seem to point to the idea of a redescription, right? Why couldn't all these ways of acting, fit pre-existing languages, pre-existing ways of thinking quite neatly? I don't think Rorty says too much about that. But clearly he's trying to reduce sort of the difference between the real strong poet, the person who really develops new vocabularies, and everyone else, right? Maybe it's not the same thing, but at least there's a certain kind of continuity there. And I think that's necessary for Rorty to do something like that, because he's going to talk about a liberal society as a society that is safe for strong poets. But I guess at the same time, it's going to be safe for everybody's individual contingent ideas about what makes their life worth living and what they want to do with their life and who they are, even if they're not strong poets, right? We don't want to end up with poet kings instead of philosopher kings in the Rortyian liberal community. It's got to be a democracy, and that means that in some sense everybody, has to have a stake in this liberal society that he is dreaming of. Rorty says some more stuff on page 37 about the difference between, just a private obsession on the one hand and like real genius on the other hand. And this doesn't seem to be a very worked out theory, and I'm not sure it's a theory that works, because basically what he tells us is that the difference between genius and fantasy, this is page 37, is not the difference between impresses which lock on to something universal, some antecedent reality out there in the world or deep within the self, and those which do not. Rather, it is the difference between idiosyncrasies which just happen to catch on with other people, happen because of the contingencies of some historical situation, some particular need which a given community happens to have at a given time. And so he suggests that, the distinction between genius on the one hand and perversity on the other hand just has to do with how many people take it up. And the reason I don't think that works is that it doesn't seem to me that what we would call like an eccentricity or even more clearly a perversity is defined by the fact that not a lot of people share in it. Or conversely, that we would define genius in terms of a lot of people sharing it. And so if we think of Proust as a genius, and if we think of somebody who makes some, I don't know, dubious fetish videos as a pervert, I don't know whether we should think of him that way, but if we are using this word perversion, which Rorty is using here, well, it's not clear that there are more people reading Proust than people watching dubious fetish videos on the internet. So I don't know whether Rorty can get anything done with this idea of numbers, right? I think what he needs, one suspects that the difference between genius and perversion has something to do with fruitfulness, right? It has something to do with whether it can be a stepping stone in further developments, right? And a poet or a writer of genius or a composer of genius or anyone else of genius is somebody who and this actually fits what Bloom has to say about that very, very well, is somebody who generates creativity in other people, right? Other people take it up, other people use it and change it and go on with it. Whereas these perversions they're sterile, they're stable, right? If you really, I don't know, enjoy watching feet, yeah, okay, and other people enjoy watching that too. That's always going to be the same, right? Pornography is just the endless repetition of the same, and genius is not. So I think that might be a better way to start making that distinction. Not very, very important for Rorty's story. If he has to plug in a different story here, a different distinction between, on the one hand, idiosyncrasy, perversity, on the other hand, genius, I think he can do it. Doesn't undermine what he is saying. So let us move towards the very end of the chapter. So starting from page 40, like the bottom of page 40, there is this beautiful sentence. Even if we drop the philosophical ideal of seeing ourselves steadily and whole against the permanent backdrop of literal, unchangeable fact, and substitute the ideal of seeing ourselves in our own terms, of redemption through saying to the past, "Thus I willed it," it will remain true that this willing will always be a project rather than a result, a project which life does not last long enough to complete. Let's read on. The strong poet's fear of death as the fear of incompletion is a function of the fact that no project of redescribing the world in the past, no project... Sorry, gotta take a sip of tea and then I will reread it. The strong poet's fear of death as the fear of incompletion is a function of the fact that no project of redescribing the world in the past, no project of self-creation through the imposition of one's own idiosyncratic metaphoric, can avoid being marginal and parasitic. So what we learn here is that the strong poet is a tragic figure. It is somebody who can never succeed. Right? It is somebody who has a goal to recreate themselves, to take up the entire past and reform it in their own image, to become completely self-created, to become gods. But that is a project that you can never complete. Right? You will always be in a certain relation to the past. You will always be influenced by the past. There is no such thing as a self-created beginning. And it's not just, I would say, that life doesn't last long enough to complete. Because if you lived longer, you still couldn't complete it. I mean, at most, You could live so long that you became your own history, but then you would have to free yourself from your own history. I mean, who wants to be hemmed in even to what he did or she did 10 years ago? I mean, do I want my 10-year, like myself of 10 years ago, come to me and say, hey, you can't do that, Victor, because this is the way I think about things and you must think about that too? No, of course not. I want to, you gotta kill even yourself, your past self. This is not a suggestion for suicide. You gotta kill your past self in a metaphorical sense. So, how do we deal with that? I mean, this vision that Rorty is trying to sell us turns out to be a tragic vision, right? That can never succeed. That will always fail. How do we deal with that? Well, one of the things that we have to find, that we have to understand, and that we have to depend on, is the future. So here is, and not just the future in some abstract sense, but future people. Bloom reminds us, this is page 41 near the bottom, Bloom reminds us that just as even the strongest poet is parasitic on her precursors, just as even she can give birth only to a small part of herself, so she is dependent on the kindness of all those strangers out there in the future. Right? You become a strong poet only by being taken up by others. The distinction between genius and perversion is precisely whether you are fruitful, whether you will be taken up, recognized, embraced by those people in the future. It's not something you can do yourself. You've got to hope. This is where we probably should go and read Emily Dickinson's poem. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. But I'm not going to read that because I don't have it in front of me. Okay, so there can be no fully Nietzschean lives. We are always, dependent on both the people of the past and the people of the future. That's true maybe even in the strongest sense, for this strong poet. All right, but that means that there is nothing private about poetry. This is not something that Rorty says, this is something that I say. Right? That means that there is nothing private about poetry. The very attempt to lead the poetic life is putting oneself in this historical tradition in which we inevitably and essentially depend on other people. The people of the past and the people of the future. And so, this idea that on the one hand there is a private project, and on the other hand there are public projects. And poetry is sort of our private drive, right? And being a liberal and making sure people don't suffer is a public project. That seems to be very problematic. Now, Rorty is going to tell us more about the public versus private distinction soon. I want us to keep this in mind. I want us to keep in mind that at least in a sort of any usual sense of what it would mean for something to be private or public, in any usual sense of those words, there is nothing private about being a strong poet. It is all about finding your place in a continuous tradition that involves essentially both past and future persons. Alright, that's what I wanted to say about chapter 2. I hope to meet you again for chapter 3, where we will talk about the contingency of a liberal community.